Hello. Thank you all for coming today. I'm Don Wilson from the Ruthie Lloyd Information Center, RELIC, our local history and genealogy department for the public library. We are honored today to have Dr. Peter Henriques speak again. He comes at least once a year to tell us generally something about George Washington. And today he is going to be speaking about the marriages of the first two presidents of the United States, George Washington and John Adams. And with that, I will turn it over to Peter.
Thanks, Don. We go way back, as you can look at both of us and see. I used to be the editor of a history magazine when I was at George Mason, Northern Virginia Heritage, and he was on the editorial board back then and did things. And we have another active local historian over here that contributed to it. So it's good to see some familiar faces. It looks like I stacked the house here with some of the people that I know, but I'm glad that you were willing to come out and give a talk. As Don said, today we're going to focus on marriage, and that will be kind of the central point. I remember an interesting quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg when they asked her, "What's the secret of a happy marriage?" And I think she wisely responded, "Be a little deaf. Don't hear the thing that's going to tick you off." And very often it can slide over. So be a little deaf is, I think, good advice. On the same token, in a lighter fashion, be careful of what you say. You can get in trouble. I know a story of a man's wife got out of the shower and noticed in the mirror and didn't like what she saw. And she said to her husband, she said, "I feel fat and old and ugly. I need a compliment." He said, "Well, your eyesight's pretty damn near perfect." So you're gonna, that's probably not the way to start happy marriage. So you can remember that. On to the talk. This is a picture of the reading room of the new library, the Fred Smith Library at Mount Vernon. And in it they have the bust of 6 remarkable men that historians have judged to be the most important of America's founding fathers. George Washington and John Adams, America's first and second presidents, are 2 of those 6 men. Both men richly deserve to be there. More importantly for our story, both men desperately wanted to be there, to enjoy what I call secular immortality, fame across the ages. While beyond definitive proof, I'm convinced that their wives played a central and crucial role in helping them achieve their very lofty goals. For both men, the choice of their lifetime partners was the most significant action of their entire lives. And I wanted this evening kind of to examine those relationships in a bit of detail, see in what ways they're similar, in what ways they're different, and why they were so important. But first, a disclaimer. Intimacy is by definition an inherently private affair, which in some ways will always be closed to the outside observer, who's barred from the bedroom and from the many intimate conversations and disagreements that a married couple will have. To try to understand accurately a relationship between a man and a wife of over 40 years in Washington's case, or over 50 years in Adams' case, is very difficult. And having been married over 60 years myself, I can assure you it is difficult to summarize it and tie it together. So undoubtedly, at some points, I have it wrong. There's just too much we do not know and cannot know. That's true of both couples. Abigail and John, we certainly know more about them as a couple. And the reason we do is because we have almost 1,200 letters between the two of them, which is a tremendous treasure trove. Conversely, Martha Washington, I'm convinced at her husband's request and instruction, burned all of their correspondence, with only a couple of letters accidentally surviving the flames. But despite the disclaimer that we can't fully understand their marriages, there's enough material, written and otherwise, that I think if you analyze it, you can get a good sense of the marriages and see why they're so important. While different in several respects, both were successful, and they played a decisive role in the founding of our great nation. I do think attention needs to be given to our founding mothers as well as to our founding fathers. Several differences. Abigail Adams was barely a teenage bride by the time she married John, who was almost 10 years her senior. Martha, nearly a year older than Washington, was already a 27-year-old widow and the mother of 4 children, 2 of whom, Jackie and Patsy, were still living. George might have been first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. He was not first with Martha. Now, Abigail and John had 4 children that lived to maturity. George and Martha were, for whatever reason, unable to have children of their own. And despite their age difference, Abigail predeceased her husband by 8 years. And on the other hand, Martha lived about 2.5 years after her husband died. So let's first examine the relationship between John Adams. These are fairly early portraits taken of John. I don't like the John as much. Abigail gives you a little bit better feel for this remarkable woman. And almost all scholars recognize this is the most significant marriage of the founding era. Primarily, John Adams is a remarkable man, but Abigail Adams is a equally remarkable woman, extraordinarily intelligent, with a gift for language, a flair for independence, and a capacity to love. I don't know whether you have seen, I recommend if you haven't seen, the show John Adams with Paul Giamatti and Laura Linney. It's excellent, and they kind of promoted it as America's first power couple, and in many ways they were. Considering their lifelong love affair, it's interesting that in Adams' journal, his first reference to Abigail, when she's only 15 years old, was not fond, not frank, not candid. That was his assessment. But as things sometimes happen, that assessment changed pretty quickly. His good friend, Richard Cranch, was courting Abigail's older sister, so they went to the home of Reverend William Smith. Abigail's father was an important minister, ultimately marrying them. And after his visits to the home, his first letter to Abigail that survives in 1762 shows a dramatic change. It's written addressed to Miss Adorable. And he insisted that Abigail was in debt to him, quote, for the kisses I have given you, 2 or 3 million at least. There is a certain ardor in their early relationship. There's no question about that. Nosy folks like to ask, did they or didn't they? Remains unanswerable. But it is interesting that passion may have outrun the parson, because their first child was born less than 9 months after they got married. Now, their marriage was a very interesting one, and an unusual one for the 18th century. Not only was she a remarkably intelligent woman, Abigail was, in John Adams' words, saucy. And he meant saucy in a complimentary way. There was a presumed sense of psychological equality between them that Abigail expected and John found intoxicating. He was attracted to her because she was bright, she was informed, adversarial, and honest. He was marrying a woman who was capable of both unconditional love and personal independence. Abigail aimed to be her husband's intellectual partner, if not his equal. She was mainly self-educated, read voraciously, taught herself French. And in her letters, she quoted from an extraordinary array of writers, just to give you a few examples, from John Dryden to Alexander Pope, to Shakespeare, to the Bible, to Polybius, to Charles Rowland's Ancient History, among many others. And the correspondence, when you read it, has an openness and candor and intellectual character that could only come from two people who regarded each other as intellectual comrades. Now, while brilliant, John was also an intensely passionate and vain man, with great emotional swings up and down. There's a famous quote from Benjamin Franklin, who, while saying that Adams was always an honest man, often a wise man, but sometimes completely out of his senses, kind of catches this element of him. And an early letter from John to Abigail recognizes his mercurial temperament and why he needed Abigail. He wrote her this: "My soul and body have been both thrown into disorder by your absence, and a month or two would make me the most insufferable cynic in the world. I see nothing but faults, follies, frailties, and defects in anybody lately." Then he went on, "But you who have always softened and warmed my heart shall restore my benevolence as well as my health and tranquility of mind. You shall polish and refine my sentiments of life and manners, banish all the unsocial and ill-natured particles in my composition, and form me to be that happy temper that can reconcile a quick discernment with a perfect candor." Over the years, Abigail met that crucial need, and then some. Basically, she is his emotional ballast, his security blanket, where he felt bathed in love. If John was rather neurotic, Abigail was remarkably sane. And over again, she tempered his tendency towards vanity and displays of ostentatious erudition, which you almost could not help quote a million sources, and you can't imagine how well read he is until you look at him more carefully. She's always his champion. I mentioned the Benjamin Franklin quote. When she learned of it, she took it personally. She said, "It wounds me. When he is wounded, I bleed." And that's the kind of wife that she was. And time again, John emphasized how he needed her. Once as vice president, he wrote her, he come to me, he said, if anything, sell things at any rate, or leave it to the birds of the air and the beasts of the fields, but come. As president, he wrote, "I must go to you, or you must come to me. I can't live without you." And facing the many problems of the presidency, he wrote, "I never wanted you more in my life. I can do nothing without you." And the reason he can do nothing without him, obviously, naturally somewhat of an exaggeration, but the main point is Abigail is not only John's comforter, she is his advisor. She accompanied John when he became our first ambassador to England, and her letters home make clear she knows what's going on in these complicated negotiations. She influences his actions as president in terms of sending an envoy to France, for example, or, less positively, signing the Sedition Act, Act, which is one of the blots in most people's minds on John Adams' career, and she was a great supporter of that act. I think the most famous aspect of Abigail as an advisor is a letter that some of you might have heard of, where she says, "Remember the ladies." It's an interesting letter where she said, "I desire you should remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we're determined to foment a rebellion, and we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws by which we have no voice or representation." It's a wonderful letter, but it would be a mistake to read too much into this letter and make her into a 21st century feminist, because she wasn't. Gordon Wood, who's probably the best scholar of this period that America has produced, made the comment that Abigail was not a modern feminist and never became one. An excellent biography of the couple, Abigail and John, was by Edith Gellis, and in that book, she made this conclusion talking about the letter. She said, "Abigail did not think beyond separate spheres of action for men and women, nor did she question the subordination of her gender. While she understood the latent implications against the sexist assumptions of the day, she realized that was in the future. She accepted the fact that she would run the household and subsume her own ambition within the life and work of her husband, and prepare her only daughter, Nabby, for the world that was rather than the world that ought to be." Mentioning Nabby, the only daughter, the rearing of their 4 children was a very important part of their relationship. They had 2 other children that died young. And I don't think one can understand the relationship with the children or in general without bringing up a little bit of their religious views, because they are steeped in products of New England Puritanism. As I said, Abigail's father was a prominent minister. At one time, it was considered that John might go into the ministry rather than into the law profession. They grew up in religious communities that left little doubt in their minds on the questions of what is good and what is evil, what is right and what is wrong. It's a fundamental force in their lives. Belief was like the air they breathed, and it surrounded them as a truth that sustained their lives. They retained a moral compass from the Puritan past that governed their aspirations and their behavior. And when sorrow came, as it often did, they depended upon religion for consolation, Abigail more openly than John. And the greatest personal tragedy they had was the death of their only daughter from breast cancer in her late 40s. It's very touchingly done in the show John Adams. Poor Nabby has to undergo mastectomy without any anesthesia. Despite that, within a couple of years, the cancer had spread, and she comes home to die in her father's arms with her mother sobbing by her side. As Abigail described, "I'm in the furnace of affliction." And she wrote of the death of Nabby, who she called her closest companion. It was an irreparable loss. It caused a wound which cannot be healed. Yet she found comfort by submitting to a rather paradoxical religious belief that good was always embedded in terrible experience, and furthermore, there can't be good without evil. As she put it in one of her letters at the time, "My confidence in the Supreme Maker will remain unshaken, and my belief that all partial evil will terminate in universal good is firm, even though we cannot perceive how or when." And the Puritan faith influenced the way they brought their children up. Always remember, they said, you are accountable to that being who brought you into existence. John wrote, you're blessed with excellent parts. Don't dishonor themselves by anything unworthy. Abigail wrote an amazing letter to John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, you can't imagine a brighter son than that. And she wrote him an interesting letter, at least by modern terms. This is a picture of John Quincy Adams as a moderately young man. He looked a lot like his father as he went along. He had that same curse that many of us do. She wrote this as her son went across the ocean to be with John when he became working with France to get the alliance. She wrote this letter. Dear as you are to me, I should rather you should have found your grave in the ocean you crossed than see you an immoral profligate or a graceless child. John Quincy Adams lived up to the very high expectations, indeed exceeded them. We all know he becomes the 6th President of the United States, and probably as well read as his father, which was saying something indeed. Maybe John Quincy's remarkable acceptance impacted the lives of his 2 younger brothers, because neither of them turned out well. Charles in particular, Charles became an alcoholic, a drug addict, and an adulterer. And after meeting with Charles's wife, John made the final verdict on his son. He said, he is a madman, possessed by the devil. I renounce him as a beast. And he never spoke to him again. Abigail was more sympathetic to Charles and visited him on his deathbed. And upon his death, she wrote, weep with me over the grave of a poor unhappy child who cannot now add another pang to those which have pierced my heart for several years past. The biggest strain on their marriage was John's long absences from the new country. At first, they were more bearable, and there's a wonderful letter from Abigail to John, and gives us an idea of their relationship and their feelings. Abigail writes this, here I say I've amused myself in reading and thinking of my absent friend, sometimes with a mixture of pain, sometimes with pleasure, sometimes anticipating a joyful and happy meeting, whilst my heart would bound and palpitate with the pleasing idea and with the purest affection. I have held you to my bosom until my whole soul has dissolved in tenderness and my pen has fallen from my hand. It'd be nice to be married to a woman who would write that to you. Unfortunately, Adams's many long absences, this is him working on the left-hand side, working on the Treaty of Paris, doing 10 years from 1774 to 1784, they were gone, they were apart for 75% of that time. Adams and Abigail, John and Abigail, were gone separate from each other more than Martha and George during the Revolutionary War, which on the surface you probably would not expect to be the case. Abigail had wanted to go to France when John went in 1778, but she would not get his permission. It's kind of interesting. She wrote a friend she could not convince John to let her come, even though their son John Quincy did go. I think that says a little bit something about their relationship too. She wanted to go, but he simply would not give her permission. And when John was away, deeply involved, the letters were few and far between, and left Abigail sometimes really hurt. One time there was more than, I think a year went, maybe because some of the letters are stolen and lost at sea, but she went a year without a letter. And she began to think of herself as a widow, and at one point said she wondered, has John found, somebody else in France? And by the way, there's not a shred of evidence that John was anything other than absolutely loyal and and faithful to Abigail throughout their long marriage. But even these long absences, which did cause friction and trouble, seemed to dissipate when they got back together again. They loved each other. They enjoyed each other's company. They trusted each other, and they were loyal. Maybe the romantic passion dims, as it often does in a long marriage, but not their need for each other. In Abigail's words, she put it this way: years subdue the passion, the ardor of passion, but in lieu thereof, an affection and friendship deeply rooted persist, which defies the ravages of time and will survive while the vital flame persists. Of course, the vital flame will ultimately be extinguished. And while they enjoyed a relatively long retirement after Adams lost the election of 1800 to Jefferson, health issues were a big issue in the last years of their life, and more so for Abigail. She suffered from rheumatism and rheumatic fever that caused a significant amount of discomfort. Even with that, she died pretty suddenly in 1818. She collapsed with typhoid fever, most likely had a stroke, which made it hard to speak, although she murmured to John that she knew death was near. She told him if it were the will of heaven, she was ready. She had no wish to live except for his sake. John was inconsolable watching her at the end. This is from the John Adams show as he's saying goodbye to her. And he writes, "I wish I could lie down beside her and die. I can't bear to see her in this state." She died on October 24th, 1818, at the age of 74. John fully expected to join her. This is a picture of him as an old man. I like this. It's an excellent painting by Gilbert Stuart, late in Adams' life. He says, "The grim specter, so terrible to human nature, has no sting left for me." But little did he know that he would live for over 8 more years. Of course, most of us know, living till July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of our great nation's birth, and dying the same day that Jefferson did. So it would be 8 years before he was finally laid to rest next to his beloved Abigail. And they've been together ever since. Now, while also interesting and inspiring, the marriage between George and Martha was different in a number of ways beyond those mentioned earlier, and I want to just point some of them out to you. Years after Washington's death, John Adams wrote to Benjamin Rush and said, "Would Washington ever have become commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Army or President of the United States if he had not married the rich widow of Mr. Custis?" Now, you can't answer that question with certainty because, unfortunately, history doesn't let us run through them. Wouldn't it be nice, should I marry this guy or this guy? You know, okay, you decide which one to do. But it doesn't work like that. You do it, and that's the way it is. But one can make a strong case that the answer would be no if he had not married the rich widow of Mr. Custis. Now, there's no doubt that Martha's wealth was a major attraction to George Washington. He had several times earlier explored connecting with a wealthy woman. And Martha was the wealthiest widow in Virginia. Her husband, Daniel Custis, had died suddenly in 1757, leaving no will, but leaving Martha with 2 very young surviving children and a large fortune in slaves, land, and surprisingly liquid capital. It's very hard to know what's worth modern certainly many millions of dollars in modern terms, a millionaire many times over. And whoever controls such a estate, and of course the man would control the estate, would immediately be thrust into the top echelon of the Virginia gentry. We can't be sure, but there's little evidence that George had more than a passing acquaintance with Martha prior to her husband's death. As far as I know, there's no specific references available in the record, although they were at Williamsburg, and so there was probably connection that way. I think it's safe to assert that he would not have married her if she had not been wealthy. But happily for Washington and our story, Martha is much more than simply a rich widow. In the first place, she was physically attractive. This is an artist, modern effort. We think of Martha, with that little mob cap and, not kind of a plain Jane type, but not at the time. Martha conformed to the 18th century ideal of femininity, buxom yet small and delicate. Her biographer, Pat Brady, said she was a real cutie. But more important than her physical attractiveness, Martha had an extremely winning personality. Now, intellectually, she is no Abigail Adams. Her letters show no great depth of reading or intellectual brilliance. Indeed, many of her letters are written by her husband or his husband's secretary, and she copies them out. You can only get a better feel for her own letters when she writes to her niece, Fanny, and stuff like that. But although she lacks that, she's very high on what I call EQ, emotional IQ, especially in empathy and social skills. Warm, talkative, she exercised her influence through what I call a deferential style that focused on making other people feel comfortable, happy, and well taken care of. One might say, I just learned this phrase from a friend the other day, I like it, she communicated nice. Some people communicate nice. You meet them, you kind of like them. I kind of like to think my wife, she's not here, so I can say it. She communicates nice. People want to share and talk with her and that type of thing. Almost everyone's recollection of Martha is positive. The French general Chastelot wrote that Martha appeared to me to be one of the best women in the world and beloved by all about her. For American soldiers, she was known as the good lady, and she did a great deal to champion their needs. Tobias Lear, Washington's personal secretary, who I quote from time to time in this talk, Mrs. Washington is everything that is benevolent and good. And Abigail Adams, who's always perceptive in her comments about people, wrote that Mrs. Washington is one of those unassuming characters that create love and esteem. Her manners are modest and unassuming, dignified and feminine, not a tincture of hauteur about her, very much down-to-earth kind of person that people responded. There are two vignettes to share with you that I think kind of illustrate that. One involves her marriage to Daniel Parke Custis. Daniel Parke Custis was a confirmed bachelor, 39 years old, when he married the young Martha Dandridge, and appeared to be a confirmed bachelor because apparently no woman he was interested in could get past the barrier of his cranky father, John Custis IV, who was an eccentric and dominating father. Martha's family was respectable, but not high at all in the Virginia gentry scheme. Yet meeting Martha in person, there's a wonderful letter from one of Daniel Parke Custis' friends. He said, I'm writing you to say your father lets you know that he heartily now and willingly consents to your marriage to Miss Dandridge. He has such a good character of her that he'd rather have you marry her than any lady in Virginia. Indeed, he's as much enamored of her character as you are with her person. That's pretty clever. Well, she gets to meet him and wins over this cranky man. Yes, go, I'd love to have you as a daughter-in-law. It would be nice if we had that power. Let's bring up the kids. I've got 4 sons. Check them. I think you would be a good one. But that's not the way it works. And there's a little-known letter from Tobias Lear to the president's nephew, George Augustine Washington, which flashes, I think, a little light on Martha's personality. When Lear wanted to know how people were reacting to the fact when Washington becomes president, he makes the decision not to make any visits or accept visits. And does this seem too haughty? So Lear writes and says, as the ladies are very expert in this business, I suppose Mrs. Washington should do it, kind of find out what the coon is. I know of no person better qualified. I know of no person better qualified. Her very serious and benevolent countenance would not let a person hide a thing from her, which would be kept from another whose countenance was not so much in their favor. I'd give a great deal, he goes on to say, to be present when you tell Mrs. Washington of this assignment. If she ever put a frown on, it would be now. What does he mean, she'll exclaim. Does he wish to make a spy of me? Who knows, if I should engage in this business, I might be brought before a high tribunal. Lord have mercy on me, be executed. I have laughed, my dear Major, at my imagination, and if I cause a smile to you or your amiable partner, I'll be amply repaid for writing a few lines. But that's kind of the way they sense how Martha is. Now, what was the relationship between the two of them? This is the earliest picture of Washington. Interestingly, it's when he's 40 years old, but he dons his uniform from the French and Indian War, and this is the earliest portrait of Martha. Their marriage, which is on January 6th of 1759, I think undoubtedly begins as what I'd call a marriage of convenience. They both needed each other and would benefit from this marriage, and I could go into that. Washington, soon after his marriage, declared, I am now fixed at this seat, Mount Vernon, with an agreeable consort for life, and I hope to find more happiness in retirement. Washington's retiring, by the way, at the age of 26 from the world at this time, than I ever experienced amidst a wide and bustling world. Now, Martha may have begun as a agreeable consort, but there's no doubt over the years it grew into a marriage of deep affection and love. Sally Carey Fairfax, a fascinating side story to Washington. She might have been his first love, but Martha Custis was the real love of his life. And let me lay out the reasons for making such an assertion about the nature of their marriage. Fortunately, 2 of Washington's many letters to Patsy, that's what he calls Martha, escaped the flames to which Martha had consigned the letters. And I'm convinced at Washington's request, and I wouldn't be surprised with Washington's help, because the letters are burned on both sides. She could easily burn the letters that he wrote her. It's not so easy to burn the letters that she wrote him without some kind of cooperation. Significantly, it was addressed to my dearest and written immediately after Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Army. My dearest, I should enjoy more real happiness and felicity in 1 month with you at home than I have the most distant prospect of reaping abroad if my stay was to be 7 times 7 years. My dear Patsy, I retain an unalterable affection for you, which neither time nor distance can change. Later he referred to her as the partner of all my domestic happiness, And in his will, he didn't refer to her as his wife or beloved wife, but twice as his dearly beloved wife, and made her one of the executors of his will as well. In an effort to reassure Martha, Washington writes he will be back in the fall when he's off in 1775. Well, he'll be back at Mount Vernon not in the fall, not in the next fall. It will be 6 years before he will come back to Mount Vernon. And then only for a brief stop on the way to Yorktown. And that fact leads to a very interesting result. Since the conditions of war did not allow Washington to go to his wife, she is going to come to him. I mean, what better excuse if you don't want to be hon, I love you, but I'm busy. You know, I'm commander-in-chief of the army. I don't have time for you. Washington needs her, wants her to come. She comes every single year to join Washington. She spends approximately half of the war years with him or in close proximity to him. Although the travel in those days took a great toll on her health, extended the time she had to spend away from her beloved Mount Vernon, suffered exhaustion and illness during the years, but she always continued to endure for her husband, kind of fulfilling the role of the loyal and dutiful wife, kind of the wind beneath your wings type thing. And I think it's important why this is true, in my judgment. Why does Washington so desire Martha to come to be with him? It stems from the fact that she gives him a gift every bit as valuable as the economic security conferred on him. I call it the gift of psychic security. One of the most revealing or inadvertent statements Washington makes about marriage is when he thinks his stepson is going to get married, and he refers to he's too young to realize that his own peace and the happiness of another was dependent on how the marriage worked out. Washington's choice of words is instructive. Essentially, this is an event that determines a man's peace or lack of in the future. And that's what he received from his marriage to Martha. As Abigail was John's emotional security blanket, so was Martha for George. She gave him the kind of unconditional support and love that his personality, I don't obviously have time to go into it, though there is a chapter in my book, on Washington's relations with his mother, which is a complicated, difficult one. Her mother is very, very demanding and not giving of praise. And Washington seems to need this kind of activity. Unlike his mother, Martha was always calm and faithful, rarely, if ever, burdened her husband with troubles or complaints. Mercy Warren's description, the benevolence of her heart, and her affability, candor, and gentleness qualify her to soften the hours of private life or to sweeten the cares of the hero and smooth the rugged scenes of war. The wind beneath your wings in the song kind of catch that. And people comment on their loving, many people comment on the loving relationship. Nathaniel Green, for example, says, Mrs. Washington's excessively fond of the general and he of her. And there are many of others. They apparently wore, they had miniature paintings. Martha definitely wore a miniature of Washington around her neck, and the evidence indicates that Washington did as well. Unfortunately, the letters are burned. One of my friends, who was the editor of the Washington papers, when they were looking back through a letter that Washington wrote, Martha had written a note on the back side of it about a silver cup, but it just starts, my love. And it's just a little, touch. That's how she wrote the note. Certainly not planning for historians to see it, but it was just kind of, that's the way they felt. And she's the one person, I mean, Washington is always on stage, tremendous pressure to do this, and he could be himself. He trusted her, he confided in her. She possessed a set of keys to his study. No, I don't like to see the word study. And a non-essential fact completely, that was the key word in Wordle yesterday. And for only the second time in 280 times, I missed it. I said stump, stuck, stuff. Anyway, I didn't expect that. Just hit me like, no, study. I don't want that word. If you haven't played Wordle and like words at all, it's great fun to do. We look forward to it each day. My wife and I play it together. Well, anyway, back to the point at hand. For finish up. When Washington, as president, determined to send some of his enslaved workers back to Virginia. Pennsylvania had a law, if you stayed in Pennsylvania for over 6 months, you could claim freedom. He wanted to do this and not let anyone know. He writes to his secretary, Lear. He said, no one should know except Martha. And there's no reason why she needs to know, except that she's his wife and he shares these things. There's a letter that I did not know about. A friend at UVA, the Washington paper, sent me from the letters of General Henry Knox and his wife, where there's a fascinating letter in where Knox writes to his wife the general's letters to Mrs. Washington. This is dated the 12th, wherein he informs her of every maneuver, however trifling, which has been taking place since the opening of the battle. In other words, here's concrete evidence that Washington is writing Martha specific, detailed accounts of the war's maneuvers to her, which is something I had not really seen until that letter. A couple of vignettes to close up our story. Washington is the dominant partner. It's Virginia in the 18th century, but it's partner as much as dominant. Often what Martha wants counts a great deal. He'll write, Mrs. W. wants such and such a thing, and he'll acquiesce in actions that he did not agree with because of Martha's desires. For example, Ona Judge, who's a famous runaway slave. Martha wants her back, and really it leads to one of the worst chapters in Washington's life, her effort to get Ona Judge back, even to moving to kidnap her. He was really willing to let her go, but Martha wanted him to get her back. She was his personal aide. Another example is with their son, Jackie Custis, who is a real troublemaker, and he wants to get married, drop out of school. Washington initially says, no, you're too young. Then he finds himself writing, contrary to my judgment, against my wishes, I'm agreeing, because Martha wants to have them married so she can come and live at Mount Vernon with them. Her daughter, Patsy, a sad human story, Patsy, dies of an epileptic fit in front of their parents at the age of 17. As you can imagine, the personal tragedy. Washington wrote, this sudden and unexpected blow, I scarce need add, has almost reduced my poor wife to the lowest ebb of misery. And when you look at Washington's diary, he changes his schedule to be with her for a significant period of time to help ease during this difficult time. And he couldn't say no to the marriage of Jackie and Eleanor Calvert because Martha wants it and wants the child, another woman in the house. And there's an interesting exchange talking about Jackie. Washington had natural immunity, not natural, but immunity to smallpox that he got when he went to Barbados. And smallpox is the scourge, more like COVID or worse in that time. And he wants Jackie to be vaccinated, but Martha is she is such a worrywart about her son, he decides to have Jackie vaccinated without telling her. And then writes to the tutor who's doing this and says to him, don't write me, because if she sees a letter from you, she'll open it to find out what's going on with Jackie. The point it's revealing to me, here's a letter that their relationship is such that if Martha sees a letter from her son's tutor directed to her husband, she's going to open it to read it. And he's not going to say, don't do it. And that, I think, says something about a relationship. I don't think there's any way that Martha ever would have written the kind of letter that Abigail wrote to John Quincy Adams in terms, better that you die than be an immoral profligate or a graceless child. She spoils both her son Jackie and Jackie's son George Washington Parke Custis, and Washington reluctantly acquiesced. I think he apparently preferred spoiled youngsters rather than an unhappy wife. They unfortunately didn't have any children. There is this famous picture of Washington children, but there's the grandchildren. These are Jackie's children, George Washington Parke Custis and Nellie. Unpure, like most marriages, their early ardor undoubtedly subsided, but they shared the same bed throughout 40 years of marriage. And since the question often comes up, as far as I can tell, there's no convincing evidence that George Washington was anything other than faithful to his wife. Obviously, that can't be proven, but the burden of proof is on the person who would take the other side. And there is a fascinating exchange of letters between Washington and his female friend, Eliza Powell, who's a remarkable woman if you want to read about an interesting woman in the 18th century. When Washington leaves the office of the presidency, he sells her his desk. And she's looking through the desk and she finds a packet of Martha's letters to George, and writes Washington and says, I have a host of letters love letters from a lady to you. And he writes back, he said, if anyone actually read the letters, I'm quoting him, they would have discovered that they were more fraught with expressions of friendship than enamored love, and the emphasis is in the original. If one expects heat from these letters, Washington joked, you'd have to put them in a fire to get the kind of flame. Well, almost unlike Abigail, Washington's vital flame was extinguished very suddenly. This is the last drawing of Washington the year before he dies. He developed an acute case of epiglottitis and died on December 14th, 1799. During the previous night, he woke up with bad labored breathing. Martha, who was recovering from an illness, wanted to go and get help. He said, no, you can't. It was a cold December night. And interestingly, she did not go until the morning when one of the enslaved workers came to get call for help. It's an interesting point again on their relationship, and some of the women. How many of you, if your wife falls down with her husband falls with a stroke, no, don't call anybody. Screw you, I'm calling. But in this case, she does what her husband wants. And you have the case of Washington slowly. I've written quite a bit about this story in both my first book, Realistic Visionary. I actually have a whole book on He Died as He Lived. This is the most famous painting, much more nice than it really was. This is not an accurate painting. Martha was not by his. There are no servants in this picture. In fact, there were more blacks in the room when he died than whites. This wood shot is much better. The two doctors with Martha at the foot of the bed. And finally, when she grasped what was happening as Washington died, Martha managed to speak with a firm voice, "Is he gone?" Lear, struck dumb with grief, could not speak, simply lifted his hands. "He is." Martha replied in the same firm tone of voice, "'Tis well. All is now over. I shall soon follow him, and I shall rejoice when the moment arrives. Martha lived until 1802, but in many ways her life ended when his did in 1799. She never slept in the bedroom again. She never left Mount Vernon again. And when death came, a relative wrote, she met death as relief from her infirmities and melancholy of old age. A contemporary wrote these words about the couple. The first of men chose her as his wife. Well did she repay his confidence and attachment. In the words of the obituary in the Alexander newspaper, she was the worthy partner of the worthiest of men. I think the more I study these two presidents and their wives, the more I realize just how fortunate our country was in having such founding fathers and founding mothers. Thanks for your attention. As those of you who have been to talks before, I'm not sensitive. Anyone can get up and leave at any time. But there's a time we throw open for some question and answer period. They can be on the talk or on Washington and broader questions. I don't mind. I always say no stupid questions. Lots of questions I can't answer, but no questions I mind you asking. So within that framework, I'll be happy to take questions. But as I say, if anyone just wants to get up and leave, I'm very comfortable. Yeah.
Did they marry their first loves? Did they have serious relationships before they chose their wives? Or are these the lucky men who first found their first love to be their last love?
I think in John Adams' case, it's, at best the evidence indicate Abigail was the only woman he ever had a close, intimate relationship with, other than a flirtatious relationship. With George Washington, it's not beyond absolute, but when you read his letters from the way his officers write him during the French and Indian War, he's a young, lusty guy, and it's pretty clear that he is not a virgin when he gets married. Whether he and Sally Fairfax had an actual sexual encounter is beyond proof. I do believe George Washington was in love with her, but that whether they actually had a relationship. For those who don't know, Sally Carey Fairfax was the wife of Washington's good friend, George William Fairfax, who was away in Washington. He wrote her a letter, a remarkable letter, where he says in the letter, basically, destroy this letter, the world has no business knowing what I'm telling you. And interestingly enough, she kept the letter hidden with all her stuff for all her years. How much do you keep a letter for 50 years? Washington's not famous at that time. If you had got a letter when he was famous, you might keep it, but he's not famous. And they found it after she died. A lot of people said it's obviously a forgery. It isn't. It's been discovered. It's at Harvard. It's a letter that clearly indicates that he proffers his love to Sally. But whether that anything happened, and really, in the way history develops, if Sally had encouraged him to do something, his career would have been over. If they had run off and gotten married and had an affair, in the Virginia society, that cuckolding your best friend is not the way to project up into office, unless your name is, no, never mind. That's the question. But he definitely, it's pretty clear from reading between the lines that it is not often emphasized, and some of the comments and jokes he makes later on make clear that factor.
Do you have a perspective on the lowland beauty? My family tradition is Lucy Ludwell Lee is the woman.
I'll take that. There's not enough evidence to come down with a specific thing. So I've not really studied it. I know, I've read different things, but I wouldn't be able to offer anything that would be meaningful, because I just haven't studied it. Yes, Helen?
After George Washington got married, did he and Martha and Sally Fairfax and her husband, were they in the same social circles? And
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And they were close and
Okay.
wrote, stayed together. When the war was coming, George William Fairfax and Sally went back to England, and Washington managed his property for him, Belvoir. There's an interesting letter that he writes to George William Fairfax, because Belvoir gets destroyed, and he says, when I looked at Belvoir and think of the happy moments I spent there, and interestingly enough, in his answer back to Washington, George William Fairfax says, when my wife read this, she left the room in tears, meaning, in other words, it touched something. And at the end of his life, shortly before he died, he wrote her a letter, which he said, when I look back over my life, and this is a man, remember, who's been elected unanimously president twice, the happiest moments of my life were spent with you. But at the same time, he includes a letter from his wife to her at the same time.
Okay.
To show, there's some things, you know, if you like the psychological things, when they sold stuff, Belvoir sold the furnishings, Washington bought some pillows. You know, I mean, you can build a good novel, great novel, but a historian has to be careful to stay within reasonable speculation. You can't just go around reaching conclusions where it's plausible. Plausible doesn't mean accurate.
Yeah.
Just because something can be true doesn't mean it is true. So you have to qualify. And obviously something like this, I do not know. But he does make comments in that letter about tender moments that we've shared in a way that could imply that, but it's not clear enough. Yes?
I know that Martha's letters were destroyed, but is there any evidence at all about what she thought of her relationship with George Washington?
Oh, Sally and, yes. You
Well,
mean-
not Sally, Martha, writing to someone else.
Oh, yeah, there's loads
She had
of-
no regrets.
She had absolutely no regret. She was completely enamored with him, absolutely, completely enamored with him. And I think completely accepting of his early love for Sally, just like you might marry someone who had, yes, before you met me, you had a girlfriend, but now I'm comfortable in your love for me, and I can even be friends with this other person. That was the kind of thing. Yes, there's no doubt that she's deeply enamored of her husband, which she sometimes calls the old man. And she's short. She's only about 5 feet. She'll pull, hey, old man, come down. You know. So it's kind of an interesting comment that way.
Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned that Abigail Adams was well-read and quoted books and authors in her letters. Did she read and quote Adam Smith by chance?
I don't know. I don't remember seeing that in the list of things that was quoted. So I can't answer that. But you can. I mean, one of the interesting things, just very briefly, there's a site online called foundersonline.com, which you go on Founders Online, and all of the letters of the founding fathers, every letter between Adams and his wife, Washington, with anyone, you type in the recipient, the person, and you can put in a quote. And you could put in, for example, Abigail Adams, and then next to her, I lost my train of thought.
Adam Smith.
Adam Smith. I got John Adams. I said, a couple more cells gone. Adam Smith, and whether she mentioned my name, I just don't know. Okay. Anyone else with a comment or a question? Yeah.
I wondered if you know anything about the relationship between Martha and Mary Washington.
Martha and Mary Washington, Washington's mother.
Right.
One of the, not much, to me, one of the strikingly interesting tidbits of fact is that after Washington got married to Martha in 1759, Washington's mother never came to Mount Vernon in the remaining 30 years of her life. They did visit her, and Martha gets along with virtually everybody, but there's no indication that they have anything of a close relation. There's no explicit hostility, but to me, obviously, the comfort is going down to see her in Fredericksburg on the way to Williamsburg. The fact that she never comes to Mount Vernon that to me is a telling tidbit. You put what weight on it as you wish. Anyone else? Yes.
Martha, as you describe her, is an attractive, social, and wealthy widow. She could have had any of the bachelors in Virginia at the time. What did George bring to the party?
You look at a man who's the equivalent of 6'5", a war hero, a remarkably capable person, and she, I think, was pretty quickly swept off her feet. She was obviously a good catch, but he is too, because he's such a solid person to take care of her affairs and her children. You know, even though they might not know each other close, they visited. She came to visit her for a few times before they got engaged, but they had a very short engagement period. But Washington is the kind of guy who impresses virtually everybody, and has the kind of charisma and physique that would, put the rest of us, oh, you're here too today? That guy, I'm out of the running. That kind of thing. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about Washington, because when I read his biography, he spent a lot of time in debt. I mean, it doesn't really ever say whether he died that way as well.
In debt? He's a very wealthy man, but he's cash poor.
Yeah.
So, I mean, actually, he borrows money to go to the inauguration, which you wouldn't expect. But on a list, when you see the list of wealthiest presidents, some people actually put him at the top because of the tremendous amount of land that he got, and sometimes in the less than ideal way. I mean, at one point, he owned 200 miles of riverfront land. And you're not supposed to own it that way. He got a lot of land from land grants in the French and Indian War. He's a speculator. We think of Washington as an Easterner, but he's Western looking. Mm-hmm. So cash poor, but not poor at all.
So he didn't leave a lot of things to be wrapped up in terms of cash.
No, he left, and he broke up his estate. I don't think he expected Mount Vernon to become the spot. I think, I may be mistaken, I think he expected to be buried at the center of the Capitol, and there was plans to have an equestrian statue of him as this pulling point of the unit, and right after he dies, Martha agrees that he can be buried there, as long as she can be buried with him. And I think he's involved in that. It's not explicit. I discuss it in my book. I think he envisions himself, I don't like using a Lenin type analogy in Russia, but this will be the tomb of our founder. And it will be, because Washington wants to unite the country, and he is the central glue that people go. He's beloved everywhere. And I think that's what he wanted. So he gives different parts of Mount Vernon away. He didn't expect it to become the central spot. But once he gets buried there, then of course he's there, and now that is the spot. Yeah.
Were these women highly involved in managing the finances of the home and the finances of the house?
certainly managing the house, the finance part, you know, I mean, this is a slave society, but Martha is deeply involved in terms of organizing all the work for company. And they have, there's a letter where he writes, if no one shows up, it will be the first time in, I don't know how many years that we've eaten alone. There's constant company coming as he's famous. There's a lot of work to take care of the guests, to see that things are run well. It's a one, I think Washington used the term, it's like a well-resorted hotel. And of course, as he gets famous, a lot of people want to come and snoop. Oh, I'd like to see the guy. And Washington gets a little tired of being, you know, an object of curiosity. Oh, there he is. But Virginia hospitality says, you don't say, move on, you come all this distance, you're going to be able to get a meal and stay here and stuff like that. If there are other questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If you've got someone who thinks might like my kind of work for Christmas or for yourself, you can come up. But if you've just got questions that you might not want to ask, I'm happy to stay for a little longer. I appreciate you giving up. There's a great quote by the Villard in NBC News. I thank you for the privilege of your time, and I thank you for the privilege of your time. Thank you.
Thank you.